for us. Steve, are you still with us? Apologies, Steve mentioned that she's having some issues due to load shedding. I think she's been kicked out. She'll rejoin shortly.
Colleagues, am I audible?
Yes, you are,
Hello.
Steve. Thank you. Yes, thanks.
Okay, thank you. So sorry, colleagues. I
Are you
was actually
sorry,
saying
Steve? Are
that,
you able to share? Okay, there I see you are able to share. Okay, perfect. Thanks, Steve.
yeah. So sorry, colleagues. We have load shedding, so I'm trying to manage also my bandwidth. So I hope I'm audible and this won't give us so much trouble. Again, Miriam and colleagues, thanks for including us and bringing us to join this session, and the third Indaba. I'm really going to present and I'm hoping that we can engage on questions later, and that will allow participants and colleagues to engage, on the presentation itself. Just to indicate that I think as a country we're going through a lot of challenges, and I think we are mindful as well of the status of the shelters in the country. Some are shutting down, the economic challenges, or as well as funding challenges, which also from our side as LGBTI community, we are aware of limitations and low capacity that exist, but also that does not warrant how we cannot also extend a hand to serving, people equally, and ensuring that there's awareness and inclusion, particularly of LGBTI persons in shelters. And I'm grateful that the shelter movement has always advocated for inclusion and prioritization of leaving no one behind. Just a bit of the work that we do as Access Chapter 2, working across various provinces. We are, of course, an LGBTI focused as well as women and girls focused organization. And our priority as a human rights organization, in making sure that the rights enshrined in the Constitution are a lived reality for all. But, while our priority in giving attention to women, girls, and LGBTI remains the core of the work that we do. But our strategic areas, we provide direct services. We have a clinic, a health clinic comprehensively, where people even can get treatment. They can start their hormonal therapy replacement and so forth in two sites. Not all our sites in all provinces we would have, but in two sites, in particular in Gauteng and in Northwest, we have those clinics, but in other sites, it's just our advocacy and other project works. And we're hoping that as part of our vision, that all other sites will have a kind of uniform approach in the implementation. The second strategy, just to add maybe on the direct service provision, is that we also provide psychosocial services, and we have full-time social workers, and we also have locum psychologists that comes once a week also in the sites. And then, of course, our legal support. We do have in-house lawyers with rights of appearance to assisting LGBTI persons, women and girls, in the human rights violations. So the day-to-day legal advice, legal service that goes into even taking the matters to equality court or supporting clients in the state cases that they potentially would have for that matter. And then we've got, of course, litigation work that we do with many of the civic matters that we will be championing around policy change and so forth. We continue to do our advocacy work as well, by virtue even of participating in the VEP forums, in the National Task Team led by Department of Justice, or the Gender-Based Violence and Femicide, or the SANEC, as particularly forums that we advocate in the country, as well as internationally in other forums. And then we continue to build capacity of stakeholders, particularly law enforcers, our priority, because we want to create an enabled environment. Police, nurses, social workers, judges. Right now, we've started a scale-up program, and that is focusing on the judiciary system as well, where we build capacity and ensure that we focus on sensitization. And then, of course, lastly, it's around research and M&E work that we do. Our work is really informed by the population we serve, predominantly focusing on people that bring matters to us, cases to us, issues to us, and it's centered around the constituency we're serving. And that's how it influences our work on a day-to-day basis. But it's also what influences us to continue championing the work, whether to change policy or to influence specific stakeholder priorities. So we give priority to a people-centered approach for that matter and their surroundings. So the ecosystem is what we apply in our work. I think one, I won't spend so much time onto this slide, but really is to look at the history we come from criminalization setup here, even in South Africa. But the history of criminalization just did not emerge. It came from the colonial laws or colonial legacies that we should never forget, why it's necessary to always fight for a just society, and always fight to make sure that we read anything that criminalizes human beings, because everyone is entitled to human rights by virtue of being human, for that matter. And the fact that LGBTI persons continued to be silenced, and they have been silenced because they've only just as a crime, even then, it's just a desire to love the next person, to love, and be themselves as well, for that matter. And that silence had ended up not just about how it muted people, but it actually wrought injustice for that matter, because people were murdered, people continued to be discriminated, people continued to be isolated for many things, and people lead a life from fear, repression, or a life that undermines their humanity for that matter. And to an extent where we've seen in South Africa that the level of hatred, the level of injustice that had been, had emerged from this silence and inequalities and prejudice and discrimination has resulted in costing lives. And that's why we've seen a rise of hate crimes and a rise of rejection in communities. And I'm saying this also with the back foot of understanding that, South Africa is also unique, that over the years, even of overcoming some of the levels of prejudice, we have developed a constitution that is the first of its kind in the world then, but it's a constitution that became a beacon of hope, for many. It's a constitution that really is it's looked upon because it actually guarantees rights, freedoms, and dignity for individual. And it's a constitution that is really principled around ensuring that people can access those fundamental human rights and values there. And the challenge remains that whether the constitution and the multiple levels of laws that we have can be implemented in accordance. Now, I thought it's also necessary to include, some of the policies that we have in the country. And I think it's quite necessary to see the extent where we come from legalization to many of the latest laws, whether you're talking about alteration of sex. So it's not by default that you have transgender individuals that will transition and will change their gender marker, and they will look like the picture, or the ID will look like the person that you will see and present. So it's not by default. It's who people are, but also that the law allows and respects the integrity and dignity of individuals. It's not by default that two people who love each other can get married. So you have all these different policies that speaks to that. And even the latest one, NCOP passed on the 15th of November, the hate crimes and hate speech legislation. So which is actually good news in particular, because for the longest time, for the last 2 decades, we have been advocating for hate crimes and hate speech law to be in place. But similarly, that when you speak about sexual reproductive health and rights, that people have got access, although some of these access that we're talking about around IVF and surrogacy, around gender affirming healthcare and so forth, it may be limited to some extent because of resource and so forth, but it's there. It's quite important. And the last one which I want to mention, and I think it also is something that even the shelter movement must think about. It's part of the recommendation I have on the slide, but is what President Ramaphosa did when he was looking at the Amendment Civil Union Act, was removing what was in the Section 6 of the Civil Union Act, which was an opt-out, that marriage officers had what we called opt-out, that if people say it's against my religion, blah, blah, and so forth, people could opt out. And that section was removed, that not in the public service that you will have an opt-out option. And I think it's something that we need to think about even in the case. Why are we doing this, and why constantly we have to always think about the situation that affects LGBTI persons? We have to think about, denial and homophobia and transphobia that exist. There are quite a number of topics in the region that generates emotions. Whenever you talk about human rights, whenever you talk about religion, whenever you talk about culture and tradition in Africa, all these generate emotions. People extremely become emotional as opposed to be objective and discussing this. And why we have to understand the implication of phobias, that the conditions of LGBTI persons, they vary, because you have to think intersectionally. Why do they vary? They vary because of the socio-economic status, the inequalities that exist. And these influences come from class, race, gender, age, the geographical locations does play a role, because you cannot think that what affects Steve in Gauteng or in Johannesburg will affect Steve who lives in Northern Cape, in Kuruman. The circumstances vary, and even if you take Gauteng just as a simple example, and you only focus on the narrative of Gauteng, the circumstances vary. The rise of hate crimes happens in township. It happens a lot against Black lesbian women or transgender individuals and so forth. So you can actually see that those do differ. You may not have a single reported case in Midrand or so forth. So you have to constantly think about circumstances and social settings of individuals, but also that the experience of LGBTI persons is really one that is experiencing the prejudice and discrimination in the multiple areas of their life, and that level of intersections have to always be applied in these experiences. But what are some of the range of human rights abuses that LGBTI people constantly experience? The loss of employment, housing, education opportunities, even employment opportunities, reduced, limited access to healthcare, safety and security. And why I'm raising all of this is that the fact that people always opt out, or they would choose to discriminate at service point, end up becoming an issue, where people will have a low health seeking behavior because people have been discriminated or rejected, or individuals or LGBTI people who face secondary victimization, in the hands of law enforcers or law enforcement officers. Whether they go to report rape, they will experience secondary victimization. And that on its own reduces the ability to access services adequately. And people also, just beyond just verbal, also experience physical attack, and even redress for that matter is an issue. And then for those who see what is happening, they may actually remain closeted, and they are forced to lead life characterized by secrecy or alienation of self and community. So I think we must understand that LGBTI persons continue to experience vulnerabilities and inequality that I alluded to, and which all of these are influenced by societal institutions in many a case. I think it's important to also cite what are some of the characterized challenges, that why we need shelters, why we need safety, why we need networks, communities of care and support, is that there's a continuation of stigmatization, there's a continuation of fear and hatred, of homosexuality, and that leads to motives of sexual assault, rape, and that leads to the corrective rape or curative. And I'll speak to this a little bit later, just to share the context from additional research work that we've done. But I think it's also important to note, just in the last 3 years, we've been seeing a rise of young queer or young gay boys who commit suicide. And I'm raising this, because even the latest one that was in the news or media about a few weeks ago, from, I think, from East Rand, where a young 14-year-old had committed suicide because of verbal abuse and bullying and homophobia in school. So we have to really see some of these. I thought I add this slide because this was also a period, 6 months period in year 2021, which actually, even when it was COVID, look at what has happened. More than 22 LGBTI people have been brutally murdered in that period. More than 30 cases of physical and sexual attack on LGBTI people, more than 100 cases reported of homelessness, because this was also a period where LGBTI persons were stuck with homophobic, transphobic families, and people were kicked out of their home and rejected by their families. And then we've also seen school dropout, and as I have stated, the serial killing. And I think it's quite important to realize that it's not a favor when we have to speak about inclusion and awareness within shelter movement. It's because people are homeless. The reason why we have shelters in creating places of safety, it's the obligation and responsibility of making sure there is a shelter, there is a place to stay or sleep, and there's a place that is safer for that matter. So it's quite important that we realize the need, and given experiences of people, we then also must realize that we are responding to a much more bigger social ills within society. And just to expand, of course, the issues of 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 murders, where bodies of LGBTI people constantly are found in open fields, serial killings and murders that constantly happen, and this is why I was stating the vulnerabilities that exist. And you can see in terms of health service, 10% of LGBTI people who continue to be rejected. 56% of LGBTI people who experience discrimination and human rights violation in school settings. And then you also see generally in communities, whether you're looking at people making comments, funny comments, and so forth. What is triggering, and I think this is necessary also for us to understand and see, is what has been spoken about in terms of even the response from LGBTI persons, that 88% of LGBTI people do not report violence against them or human rights violation, which actually then says that it gives you that number that says only 1 in 25 gets to report the incidents. And this is really a big problem when you look at the numbers, for that matter. I also thought I should share a little bit of the work we did recently, which was looking at the conversion practices. We were part of, or South Africa was part of the 3 countries that we collaborated in, and I'll explain what conversion therapy is for that matter. And when you look at this conversion practice, which is refined, I mean, we refined it. The global knowledge use conversion therapy, we call it conversion practice, because we wanted to localize it so that we can lift up the intersectional experiences of LGBTI person who engage in this, but we also wanted to engage other various stakeholders for that matter. So religious leaders, house of traditional leaders, and key members of parliament, because it's a policy issue. And as part of this program, we launched what we're calling Balam, where we localize the language and we looked at it in different ways. Inxeba lam is in English is my wound, in Tswana or in Bantu language is lebadi laka. So we wanted to localize this, and we could translate the program or the conversation about the project in a local and native language so that people can understand all of this. But what conversion therapy or conversion practice, which often refers to a method that is used to change a person's gender identity or sexual orientation, that people actually take moments and take effort to want to change others so that they can be heterosexual. So the same language, the same views that are used in communities, that are used in our centers, that we question in school, we question at health services. These are phrases that are used, and those phrases itself would be leading to believe that individual need to repair or heal from what has been understood to being wrong for that matter, or corrected for that matter. Of course, it's quite important to realize that these practices vary. It's not one-sided practice, it's multiple harmful practices that exist. In the research that we did, it actually started to point out who the perpetrators are of conversion practice here in South Africa, or even across the 3 countries that we were part of. And we also got to understand that it's not just a single event. It's not just that you are told once. You will be told everywhere, or there will be certain practices and activities taking place. But the perpetrators also include mental health workers, social workers, and psychologists, and so forth, religious leaders, medical practitioners, family members, community members, traditional healers, educators, gatekeepers of toxic masculinity and compulsory heteronormativity. But who are the first facilitators also of conversion practice are families who expose that. And you'll see even in the research for that. But part of the questions, we wanted to look at the practice, the extent of the practice, and who are the perpetrators, and what are the implication of the practice itself. We applied a dual or method, both qualitative and quantitative method, to reach persons, or to reach LGBTI persons to be part of this, and who have actually undergone, or some who have experienced a conversion practice for that matter. And as I was saying, that families, in particular parents, are the main facilitators of conversion practices for that matter, and apart from engaging the external agents for that matter. So in the home setting, you then see that the facilitated practice of conversion practice, often parents would exclude children from family events, or they will discourage them in attending. They don't want to be embarrassed. They will minimize their identity, or they will be told, you are not going to be gay, or you're not going to be queer in my house. And that's when this homelessness starts, because when you speak about children who are rejected from their home, they were told, and I mean, many of the participants have been kicked out of their home because parents have said, you are not going to be, either you become normal, and I'll put that in inverted commas, you become normal for you to be living in my house, or for me to take care of you, shifting those responsibility. Similarly, in religious institutions, and that continues to happen. People who are told, we'll pray for you, or we have to cast the demonic life from what you are going through, or we have to, or you can be part of a member of our church. And these are some of the activities that are happening. And then also you look at a conversion practice that's taking place in therapeutic interventions. I mean, we had just a recent case that we were dealing with the Health Professional Council of South Africa, where a psychologist from University of Cape Town, who was actually, having this cognitive session with trans individuals, so that they change and they become again normal, as it was said. So these activities are taking place in different spaces. LGBTI persons that participated also expressed that they were taken to traditional healers. Families sought help from traditional healers to really cleanse people and giving them portions of whatever that they need to be taking in casting the demonic spirit. But also you see this in community as well, where LGBTI continue to face discrimination, whether they go to social spaces, they engage on other, other spaces that challenges or threaten masculinity and so forth. So people often are rejected in communities. But the impact of all of these, and which I think it's necessary for everyone to realize and know and understand, is that there is always a negative outcome out of all of these practices, out of all of these homophobic, transphobic activities that are taking place. And that includes, that people experience depression, anxiety, self-hatred, low self-esteem. They continue to worsen the ideas of suicidal ideation. And once all of these happen. And I mean, if we look at even the participants that participated in the research, at least we have had more of them who had indicated they have attempted committing suicide at least once. So you have others who have done it more than once, for that matter. So all of this are influenced or are, enhanced by social stigma that exist for that matter. Many of our participants were between the ages 25, 36, and you can see, because we had majority of them up to about 47% who were of that age. And also you've had in fact, majority of them who resided in Gauteng, but then the rest were spread of other provinces. And then you also look at, the kind of population that also participated in this. You look at the gender and sexuality, where you had 28% of cisgendered women who completed the survey. And of course, you have others for that matter. Sexual orientation played a key role because we were focusing on LGBTI individuals, with 31% being gay men, 49% being lesbian women, and then you have others who may include pansexual and who others will identify as queer. But also what was interesting as part of this research, most respondents identified as Christians, which then was 61% of individuals that participated in this. And of course, also we took it as a nature of South African in terms of religion spread. So we're expecting that as well. But then you had other religious beliefs in that. And then you had respondents, about 38% of them with a matric, and then of course 34 with undergraduate or undergraduate diplomas and so forth. And then what was also interesting is that 56% of participants lived with their families. So if at all you understand and you look at all of this, you're talking about a youthful population that participated in this research, with majority of them, because it's over 50% of them, are still living with their families. So when this kind of behavior of homophobia, transphobia continues, you are going to experience much more homelessness or rejection by families. So I'm hoping it also helps you see that the reason why we should even still have shelter movement, and it must grow and must be supported and so forth, because you are dealing also with the substance of or substantial issues that are experienced in communities. So our diagnosis of what we are dealing with must actually be clearly spelled out, why there's a need as a business case as well. I don't have to go into the codes. This presentation will be shared with everyone, but I think it's necessary to always see these are codes of some of the participants. So I have experienced it from a young age because my dad used to beat me with belts or wooden spoon in anything hard. My father used to beat me up when I came out. The violence persisted until he got to know what that we exist. I was raped by my boyfriend then when he realized I was in love with another woman and not him. So you can already see some of the experiences is that when we then say that experience of prejudice, abuse, violation happens more than once, that you experience something at home, you come back, experience something if you're a bisexual woman. So it's always this recurring trauma, recurring violation that exists. They told me I need to change and all that, and I had to lie and tell them that I will do whatever they want me to do, because I could see I was losing everything at the moment, since mom was the one supporting me financially and would stop supporting me financially if I didn't change. So it's quite necessary. And then in the religious setting, I was continually prayed and fasted for, and when that didn't work, they made my cousin sleep with me forcefully. So I think it's quite important to realize that even I myself, as I'm presenting to you, I mean, even when I was very young, I remember going home for over 3 months, going home on every single day to a prayer session. And when it started, and I never realized, and I did not understand that actually that prayer session was for me. Only halfway the 3 months, I realized that those prayer sessions were actually for me, because I constantly was put in the center of the prayer group that always came to my house. So these are some of the quotes that came from the research findings, and it was already showing us what was forced, what was the practice as part of these surveys. Who did all of this, as I was summarizing at the beginning, and even the impact of conversion practice for that matter. And then when you look at what are some of the key issues, you can't speak about how do we deal with things until we even get to the source, that if we're going to be talking about prosperity for all, even people who are in the shelters, even people who are homeless, people who are violated, we constantly have to know that they've got access to services, but they also have access to economic justice, because that's also one of the kind of outcome, that resolves some of the livelihood of individuals for that matter. We always have to think about what theories of change, and this is programmatic elements that we constantly have to think about in health, psychosocial, human rights empowerment. But the impact really should speak about reduced incidents, empowered LGBTI people, health and well-being, and access to services for that matter. We believe everything that we do has to constantly take an effective response for LGBTI people. What is required, the same way that we are called here to speak of a sector response, but also a partnership response that is not and should not just be once off. So what are the necessary things that we should be looking into that applies the human rights principle that will really result in effective and meaningful response in that partnership mode? I think as shelters, there must be coordination and alignment of programs where LGBTI people are part of those processes. There must be partnership between yourself as different institutions with LGBTI organization. Ensure that your staff members in all your shelters are trained, sensitized to deal with LGBTI issues. Whatever media, targeted media interventions, and this is simple poster that you have in your clinic, your centers, your shelters, and so forth. It's not just a heteronormative pictures, is an inclusive picture, messages that are not just talking about a wife and a husband, but spouses, partners. You talk about spouses where everybody, whether heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual, can relate to. And then you also have integrated comprehensive approaches. And if at all you have policies, what level of inclusion have you done? So what are the guidelines that have been developed that should speak to affirming of diverse sexual orientation and gender identity? So the guidelines for your centers to be aware and to be inclusive should not just be guideline for LGBTI. It should be guidelines for all, and you are not making sure that you have integrated everyone, LGBTI and other orientations or identities for that matter. But also is that you provide information to even LGBTI clients that you may have, who to consult in the event of harm, abuse, neglect, who to engage when you need more support. And then you also develop your resource list for that matter. So I'm hoping this was quite useful for all of you. I will stop here, Mariam, for questions and comments for engagement. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Steve. Really appreciate that. Are there any questions? I have not seen anything come up in the chat. If anyone would like to take the floor, it's all yours.
I have a question.
Perfect. Okay, we have a question from Cindy, who is live with us in the room.
Hi, Steve. I work with GPV shelters that specifically cater to just women and children. So I want to find out, are there any policies that are being developed in order to integrate having LGBTQI individuals in our shelters? Because we know that it's not only women and children who suffer from gender-based violence, but also individuals from the LGBTQIA community also that are affected by gender-based violence. And then secondly, when you're speaking in your presentation, you talk a lot about homelessness, and we know that when LGBTQIA individuals with their family issues, then they become homeless. And then some are referred to our shelters. And that is where now, for us, even with women who are destitute, we don't take them in because there's this destitute thing associated with it, and they say it's a long process to help them find another alternative place. So is there a way to mitigate this? Are there any policies that are being developed, or yeah, I think you understand what I'm trying to say.
Answer the two questions. Steve, hi. Do you want to answer those questions, or do you want them rolling and then you go at once?
I'm happy to take more, and then I'm just taking my notes as well.
Hi, good day. Thank you for joining us. I'm live in the room. Please, I don't know. Looking at terminology, LGBTQI+. I noticed in your presentation the Q is not there. If I could just understand and be educated on that. So
I'm losing you there.
So sorry, I'm just looking at the acronym and notice that the Q is not in your presentation. In order for me to successfully, write, do I include the Q for queer, or is it excluded going forth?
Okay, got you.
Thank you.
We have another question in the room. Thanks, Steve.
Hi, Steve. Leseho. Thanks for the presentation. It was really eye-opening. But so while we were talking, I was just wondering if there is a list or a number, because I know there's Pride Shelter in Cape Town, which is one of the only shelters that I know of that cater to LGBTQ plus communities. But I wonder if there is another database somewhere of shelters that specifically cater to this group. Maybe even in the provinces that you have a footprint in, it would be good to know. But also, I think for me, some of the questions would be, what steps has Access Chapter 2 or even maybe other LGBT organizations have done to kind of alluding to what Cindy was talking about, you know, them only offering to women and children, but also when you have other lesbian women, for instance, or trans women coming into the spaces, what are some of the sensitization trainings that have been taken on to kind of like, you know, try and help make them, even if it's just for a short period, to have them, because at the time they would have been under a lot of trauma or stress. And then maybe also for me, has there been any alignment or partnership that has happened between NSM and Access Chapter 2 or your colleagues in the LGBTI sector in that respect? And then I think another question is more broader and maybe needs a lot of kind of discussion, but my thinking is, with LGBTI, a lot of us, like what you were talking about being homeless, about being chased at home, and, you know, being left on the streets. You end up being homeless, and your issues are not that off, are not being seen as GBV homeless, are not seen as of emergency, right? But obviously you're homeless at the time, it is an emergency. But what have we done, and what efforts have been done to make sure that housing is inclusive to LGBT people? Because I know that a lot of the time with housing in South Africa, especially when you are, if I want to apply for a house, I need to have a child, I need to have dependent, right? But sometimes I don't want to have kids, but I'm in need of a house, right? As a trans woman, as a lesbian woman, or as a gay man. And I might not have the means to buy a house. So I'm left then on the outside because I don't meet the requirements of me getting a house from government. So what are some of the things to make sure that housing is inclusive in this country, so that it covers LGBT, so that then we don't find ourselves with a lot of homeless? And I feel like a lot of homelessness, being in Cape Town right now, living in a Cape Town, I see a lot of homelessness around trans women, right? We have a huge group of trans women that are homeless, living under the bridge, huge groups of gay men who are homeless, you know, some lesbian women, and it's because they don't have anywhere to go, right? And it's not because they're abused, but because they're on the street, then they find themselves in abusive situations, they find themselves in sex work, they find themselves in all of these other things, just because of just the fact that I don't have a roof over my head. It's a lot of questions, I know, but I think we could be able to. That's good to see you.
And it's for me, it's not so much a question, Steve, personally, thank you, but I think it's more a discussion that we need to have, and how we need to reframe our understanding of gender-based violence. So I think a lot of times when we think gender-based violence, we see a picture of a woman being beaten by a man. But when we look at the definition, gender-based violence is violence you're experiencing. And so for me, the issue, and maybe it's also around the topic we were speaking about, around how do we also, the national shelter movement, understand the broadness of the term gender-based violence. So for me, if trans and lesbian women, have run away from home because of the home environment, for me, that is violence. And part of that reframing has to do with the fact that, and I know it's still happening, I think that's more an internal conversation where we're saying, we can only assist you as a survivor of violence if you've reported to the police station, if you come and you're wounded. But emotional violence, is a form of gender-based violence. And I think we need to open ourselves up to say we can accommodate people even if someone is not bleeding. That's the first. I think the second thing, and I'll go back to the issue of training, and how we need, I think, a formalized partnership to say, can either Access Chapter 2 or, the LGBTI sector at SANAC level, or even organizations in provinces to provide us with training. And it's not, once-off training. For me, it's ongoing training. And the training is not only for shelter staff, but also for shelter residents. Because I think even in instances where shelters are able to take someone, or shelters, have got space and can accommodate someone, there is a lot of stigma discrimination that happens in that shelter. So then maybe for us as a movement to say, whether we have, queer people in our shelters, one of the components we can offer all our shelter residents, and that can only happen once we have a formalized partnership, is to say, it is a training, it's an awareness raising, whether you can take people now or you take them in 3 years' time, is to say whoever works in our shelters will receive the sensitization, because we know the cycle of violence. We don't know where residents will be in the shelter again, what shelter they're going to go into. And I think that is, something that we can talk about and see, can we include that as, as a capacity building that, you can provide in our shelter staff, so that, they can also then continue to escalate the training. And we also know, staff move in and out, and we can't expect organizations to always come and train us. But if we are trained and kind of like maybe undergo a train of the trainers, we can then escalate that training within our spaces. Thank you.
Okay, Steve, that's been all the questions inside the session room that we're in currently. I don't see anything in the chat, and I don't see any other hands raised. The floor is yours, Steve. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the comments and questions. And maybe let me start with the last speakers. And that's the thing, because we need to redefine gender-based violence, and because you can see the understanding of violence against women and children, and then often also we then say even LGBTI, even when you are just putting a placeholder around the issue of focusing just on violence against women and children, you can't ignore that even at the vulnerability level, that lesbian women and transgender women are most vulnerable for that matter. And we have simply, as Diane is saying, we've disconnected that. But also these are dynamics of the women's movement generally, in terms of how we see, how we define, how we raise issues, that we have disconnected a lot of issues. As a Black lesbian woman myself, I would not want to be asked to separate my sexual orientation from gender identity, or even sex for that matter. That's impossible to do, so the definition and redefining of gender-based violence, it does affect LGBTI persons. And even when you say you have a shelter that is focusing on women and children, are we and I think this is particularly linking, I think it was a comment earlier around whether there's policies. I mean, we're coming from a shelter that is focusing on women and children. Yes, we understand that you may not be able to take gay men, but you may be able to take lesbian women. You may be able to take transgender women. And we know the dynamics even about transgender transgender women, and how people will then, I mean, throw a fuss, a serious one, to saying that, oh, but then, this person, still has their genital as they were born, or all these dynamics that are there. But these are guidelines. Is this shelter a women and children's shelter? And if yes, not unless if at all we've said this is for cisgender heterosexual women, then we must start to then define it so that even LGBTI people would know that they are not wanted in the spaces, because that's how discrimination of these sites or facilities are, because we did not need to redefine a woman, but we needed to make sure that when we say women and children, this is inclusive of cis and non-gender or gender diverse women in their diversity. So I think that level of policy enhancement, it gives us that opportunity to enhance our policies accordingly. The second point that I want to raise, I think Lesego, I actually don't think it was Lesego at that moment. I think there was somebody who spoke before around the issue of destitute and homelessness, and that also exists. Because until we realize that LGBTI people, and this is why I was presenting the conversion practice. With families, you are not regulated. So you may not perceive or you may not subject the issue of being rejected or being kicked out by your family as something else, because we never regulate parenting or family process. But by virtue of you violating your child in your home, and you are abusing and verbally abusing them and even physically abusing them, and you kick them out, we need to really view that. It's an emotional, it's a physical, it's verbal abuse. I'm not sure what other abuse are we looking for. Yes, people may be coming and presenting, and maybe we need to look into when do we, or how do we report when we say we have a case, and not say it's a homeless, but they have experienced abuse. So that we then develop those procedures, those policies that realizes the reality of individual. It shouldn't be a case where somebody has to die or somebody has to be murdered to realize that they were abused, or somebody has to commit suicide to realize that there is abuse, for that matter. The third issue that was raised around the LGBTI plus, I think in my presentation you would have seen we've used LGBTI plus, because if I tell, sorry,
Apologies, someone seems to have unmuted. I'm just muting them, Steve.
Oh, okay, thank you. So one would acknowledge that there's LGBTIQ, there's LGBTIA, there's a lot of acronym. As an organization, we've made a decision that we will use LGBTI plus and not necessarily LGBTQA, P, and so forth. I mean, various institutions are moving with different acronyms that they use. If you are in Canada, you will see the acronym is even much more longer than this, because then it's Two-Spirit. It's adding the acronym. The acronym goes on and on and on. But let me tell you something. Historically, even here in South Africa, up until the 80s, we've used same-sex practicing individuals. And then only then we started using the words such as lesbian and gay. And then in the 90s, it does not mean people did not exist. These are just words that people box and use to box individuals. The terms such as transgender became popular, and intersex. These are words that, and identities, and affirming words that started to be used to try box a community or population. So we find it very difficult as an institution to have our materials today. This year we have Q, next year we have to add A. It's just creating a problem. So LGBTI plus, we have defined it in all our materials. It's not exclusionary of Q, it's not exclusionary of P, A, and so forth, or two spirits. It's just to then say that we are using LGBTI plus to recognize the additional, additional identities and affirmation that others would use that we may not have recorded in our acronym usage. So it's not an exclusion. If your organization or institution wants to use LGBTIQ, you are more than welcome to do so. But I think as Access Chapter 2, we've taken that direct decision a few years, I think it was about 4 years ago, when we've just resolved that we want to standardize our materials, our processes, and so forth. So that's why you see it consistently coming out in this LGBTI plus as opposed to LGBTQA, P, and so forth. The other point around shelters, Lesego, we have created a list of shelters that we work with. Other than Pride Shelter in Cape Town, I can simply tell you, no, there isn't any other shelter that caters for LGBTI individuals. And even Pride Shelter itself is not a lot. I think when I was speaking to the coordinator there, I think it's limited. It can't even take more than 10 people. So this is a serious problem that we have across the country. Secondly, that even when we had a transitional home as AC2 during COVID, which we had to rent out properties so that if we have a crisis, we know we can place somebody for a week or two or so while we look into other options. When we have a rejection, or when we have people who have been abused and kicked out of their home whatsoever, we would work with future families, or asylum seekers that come from outside South Africa. We'd work with future families, would work with other institutions. So the list of organization shelters that we have was shelters that we have actually worked with, have asked for training, and we know that we use them as referral network, whether it's shelters that accommodate young people, or shelters that accommodate men, or that accommodate women and children, and so forth. So we will be then working with those specific ones, or working directly with social welfare where we operate. And it's not everywhere across the country. I can tell you the challenge that we have, Lesego, is that we are a limited organization with limited resources, and also dealing with quite a number of competing priorities, dealing with competing crises, that at times, that even if you want to really address the issue of homelessness, of settlement, you are unable to do that because you've got limited human resource. So even when you see an institution like ours that may have these sites across, or individual, it's not fully fledged 5-10 people. Other sites operate with one person. other sites operate with 3 people. The big sites that we have more than 10, 20 staff members are Gauteng and Northwest. And then of course, subsequently Mpumalanga, for that matter. So we are really hoping and relying other networks or organizations are able to take up this role, but we are able to be called in to do training or collaborate on trainings. We are able to consistently do refresher, mentorship, and so forth, for that matter. So we have very limited resources to do this kind of work, and while we are passionate about it, but sometimes reality really challenges us. And then of course, the last point, you know, I think the last time I presented in the Indaba, there was an undertaking between the network and ourselves. I think, you know, COVID disrupted, and I think we can retake that undertaking of partnership between, you know, the shelter movement network and really look into. And we don't have to start with big numbers. We can then say at least 1 or 2 shelters per province, you know, whether we are able to collaborate and train, whether we're able to help develop policies, whether we're able and look into, you know, a mentorship. We don't have to start with big numbers and say all must be. I think you then take it annually and look at a cascade approach to it. And I think that will take us, you know, far if we do it that way. The last comment I want to make, and I think it relates to the issue of human settlement. And I remember a few years ago when we engaged Department of Human Settlement around the status of LGBTI people and access to, you know, housing and so forth. And you are quite right, you know, the issue of whether somebody has a child must be, you know, having dependents and so forth, prioritization. It's really a big problem, because if at all even a quota or our own government and institutions are not intentional in how they want to really be addressing the needs of LGBTI people, we run that risk to always asking for LGBTI people to fend for themselves, because that's how we've been living, that the only way for us to get recognition, do things, is when we then fight for it. And then you ask, who else is fighting? Do we have allies that can quietly introduce inclusion policy that is targeting, and you're saying out of 100 houses, at least 5 to 10 houses will be given to LGBTI people, or 2 houses for that matter, you know, so that we really respond with intention, with political will of the need and responding to the challenges. So I'll pause here, and I'm hoping I've covered most of the questions and comments that were raised. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was very informative, and I think you have answered all the questions that have been raised. Yes, so with regards to presentation, we've had a few comments in the chat with regards to presentation. The recording as well as the presentation will be loaded onto our website and will be sent through to all the shelters. A kind reminder, please do not forget to register on the chat. If you're not on the chat, unfortunately, we may miss your email address with regards to our database. So please register in the chat. One of the comments that was made, GBV is broad in providing awareness. Let's also not overlook abuse that occurs between partners in the LGBTQ community. There are a few messages of thanks as well, Steve, but on behalf of the NSM and the team, we really do appreciate you taking the time out of, I know you have an extremely busy schedule, so thank you so much for taking the time and doing this presentation for us. We look forward to engaging in the future and building a partnership with Access Chapter 2. Sorry, in January. Yeah, you know, years over already, crazy last month and a half left, but we definitely look forward to engaging with Access Chapter 2 in the new year and building a partnership with you guys to go forward with regards to training the shelters and staff and the clients at the shelters. So thank you once again, and we wish you an amazing remainder of the year, a blessed one and a safe one. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, colleagues, and have a good one. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks all. Cheers. Have a good one.